Sony is scared. And this has been apparent to me ever since the Wii era, actually, that Sony has gaslit the entire gaming industry into thinking that they are the market leader, which obviously isn't true, has never been true, never will be true. But for some reason, normies and game journals really love to push this idea that Sony was the market leader when it came to video games, even though that they have no recognizable mascots, they don't have any iconic franchises, their console sales are fake, like nothing PlayStation has done has in any way been meaningful or iconic. Everything they've done just essentially amounts to a giant circle jerk of people in their circle acting as if things that they do is remarkable or interesting, like faking the PS2 sales numbers, giving away Game of the Year awards to games that they want to push, promote, like pulling all this like weird nepotistic stuff, suggesting that The Last of Us is the greatest story in all of video games. It's been like this gigantic cope session for 20 years, and we're at the point now following the Nintendo Switch 2 launch, where Sony's own investors are pointing out what's been obvious to me for the past 20 years. That Sony is not competitive with Nintendo. They are not the market leader, and their strategy of producing big budget movie games has fallen flat in comparison to Nintendo cultivating an audience that has grown up with them, intimately is familiar with all of their characters and their brands, and will continue to support them throughout their entire lives. Like Nintendo's method of appealing to the kids, the immature child demographic, has actually proven itself to be far more successful and lucrative than PlayStation's attempt at presenting themselves as the cool alternative for mature adult gamers, And it was always obvious to me that this would play out this way, but the general community just kind of refuses to admit it. They kind of refuse to admit the PS2 sales were fake. They kind of refuse to acknowledge the success of the Nintendo 64, the GameCube, the Wii, and the Wii U, right? And it's the Switch generation, throughout this entire life cycle, for the Switch and the Switch 2, we were told over and over again that the Switch would be a passing fad, that it wouldn't stick around, that the games weren't very good, that nobody enjoyed or liked it, which was a giant cope to try and bring things around, to try and get people to come back to the PlayStation platform. But the investors are, at this point, aware enough of the current situation. They see Switches everywhere. They have people in their families that play the Switch. They may own Switches themselves, who understand that like the reality of the situation is way different than the one Sony tries to present. This myth that Sony and Nintendo are not competing in the same industry, it has completely and totally imploded. Seeing the Switch 2 handedly outperform the PS5. Even with the advent of Grand Theft Auto 6, the last stand of PlayStation on the horizon, PlayStation just isn't pulling the numbers it used to. Nobody's really that fired up for the average PlayStation game, right? Nobody's running out to buy them. Nobody cares. Nobody supports them. And the company is just bleeding money outside of a core demographic of 30-year-old man-children whose entire identities revolve around gaslighting other people into thinking PlayStation is more successful than Nintendo. I'm talking game journos. I'm talking like YouTubers, and I'm talking, people like Video Game Lover 58, individuals who don't even like admitting that they are hardcore Sony fanboys. Sony built up an entire propaganda cabal to push this narrative that they were far bigger and more successful than Nintendo. But as Nintendo continues to expand and grow and reach new heights, they are closing the gap between Sony's other businesses. Nintendo is catching up to them, and it is becoming increasingly obvious that Nintendo strategies are working. Where they're gaining capital and like obtaining wealth and becoming more and more powerful and influential. Expanding into films, comics, and theme parks. While Sony has completely lambasted and just stagnated. Like they spent the past decade building up The Last of Us as their big golden goose brand. The greatest story told in all the video games, and what happened? Not only did they sabotage it with the sequel to the video game, they also botched the TV series, which has lost all of its viewer base already, and what's more, the IP has absolutely no ability to branch out into merchandising or theme parks, the way that something like Pokemon or the Mario brand or Zelda, Donkey Kong has, like The Last of Us, I think the quintessential example of what a PlayStation IP is has completely failed to establish like PlayStation's brand and what they try to accomplish. The Last of Us, a decade later has proven itself to be a completely dead-end brand, while something like Donkey Kong, which has been around since 1981, is going to get this massive resurgence of popularity due to Nintendo cultivating a unique team and style that will deliver something very much unlike anything we've ever seen before. PlayStation would not be capable of producing something like Donkey Kong Bonanza. And anyone who's been following the video game industry knows this. And, normies, having been exposed to, experts like myself, are beginning to pick up on it too. Sony's sad, pathetic attempts to give Astro Bot Game of the Year awards and to declare it the greatest platforming ever made have fallen flat. That game is getting outperformed by random Kirby titles and Donkey Kong Country re-releases. Astro Bot is never going to be on the same level as Mario, and it's just Sony just can't like trick people into thinking otherwise anymore. They used to be able to get away with like, hyping up, Baldur's Gate 3s or like Black Myth Wukongs as like these huge like, industry defining classics that like far surpass like anything Nintendo could put out. But not only did Tears of the Kingdom outperform those games, it's also stayed very, very relevant on new Nintendo consoles. The fact of the matter is, Tears of the Kingdom is one of the most popular games on Nintendo Switch 2. After all that coping and seething and trying to downplay that game when it first released, much like we saw with Majora's Mask back in the day, the game is now becoming a bit of a classic among hardcore Nintendo fans. Like, plenty of people, like myself, will come out and tell you that it's significantly better than Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild's main draw being that, like, well, Tears of the Kingdom hadn't come out yet. So, like, obviously, when they spent so much time, like, trying to, like, religiously downplay, like, Tears of the Kingdom, only for it to, like, blow up in its face, even before the sequel even comes out. Like, we're still a long way away from like the sequel to Tears of the Kingdom releasing. Like, even though it's been that long, we are still seeing a number of like of PlayStation fans like continuing to deny that it's over. Continuing to deny that like Nintendo has won the console war, that PlayStation is not like a viable brand, that the handheld division failed, that the PlayStation Portal failed, that the PS5 did not perform to expectations, that the Switch 2 has been a ludicrous success. That being a big thing and I think the main issue here, the real sign that like the wool can't be pulled over our eyes anymore. Like the fact that like the Switch 2 did so well after every Sony-controlled analyst and game journo and gaming YouTuber like insisted it wouldn't. Complaining about the price point, complaining about the game selection. That worked back in the 3DS and Wii U era. Back before people were more plugged into this and realized how corrupt these people actually were. But Like, they have not updated their tactics for the modern era. People know how good Mario Kart is. People know how good, games like Fast Fusion and Fantasy Life are. People know about, like, games like Hitman, right? Like, and even if they weren't, you would have like an entire back catalog of like great games to play on the Switch 2 eShop, like it because of it ties into the Switch 1 system. So like this idea that like, the Switch 2 had no games was a doomed failure from the very beginning. And yet like so many people like fought to deny it, for this one specific purpose, to prop up PlayStation and to keep the lie that PlayStation is the market leader just alive just a little bit longer. It's like their beloved Dark Souls, where like Gwyn sacrifices himself to stoke the first flame because he's so like scared of the incoming age of dark, the age of Nintendo, where like more people are like becoming comfortable with acknowledging Nintendo as like, the market leader. It's like that. It's just a sad, desperate attempt from an entire culture of people who have spent 30 years hating Nintendo, despising Nintendo, and doing everything to like downplay every Nintendo game that came out. At the time, this was making them money and getting them views and attention, but now it's getting them laughed at. These guys are in their 40s or even older, still trying to pretend as if Nintendo isn't competitive or relevant, when PlayStation themselves is in the early stages of kneeling, of conceding that Nintendo, not PlayStation, is the gaming market leader.